Welcome. We're very, very lucky today to have as a guest David L. Bernstein. There are many David Bernsteins, and there was even a talk show when I was looking at YouTube's The Three David Bernsteins, which this was one of the David Bernsteins. There's a David E. Bernstein who wrote a book about categorization by race by the federal government. It's a common name, but our guest has an uncommon point of view. I will read from his official biography. A passionate advocate of the free expression of ideas and Israel, David Bernstein is the founder of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, which opposes illiberal ideologies and supports liberal values in and out of the Jewish community, and author of Woke Anti-Semitism, How Progressive Ideology Harms Jews. And I didn't get a hard copy, so I can only hold up my Kindle, but this is the book. And it's very reasonable if you want to download it from Kindle. You can even get a free sample. And I read it in 2 days. It's very riveting if you're interested in American Jewish establishment affairs. He's also the co-founder of the Institute for Liberal Values, a consortium of like-minded organizations supporting liberal values, and executive director, past president and CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs and former executive director of the David Project. He spent 13 years at the American Jewish Committee in senior roles. David is a prolific speaker, podcaster, and writer. He's written hundreds of opinion pieces in the Jewish and general press. So it's really an honor to have David on our show, because he's really living up to his principles, because I've had so many people who won't come on with me, and to have somebody from the official Jewish establishment is really remarkable. I want to just start.
I'm a former guy of the Jewish establishment. I'm a heretic of this of the Jewish establishment.
Oh, I see. Okay, well, it begins to explain it.
Right.
Why don't you, before I was going to read all the list of book reviews you've gotten, but before we do that, why do you say you're a heretic?
Well, because I'm challenging this ideology, call it woke ideology, if you will. And that ideology holds that unless you have the lived experience of oppression, then you really shouldn't be talking about these issues, that these issues are beyond your grasp and beyond your authority and beyond your ability to articulate them for the rest of society. So I shouldn't be saying that I don't buy into this narrative, because I should be listening to what other people have to say. So I'm automatically a heretic if you come from the sort of woke school of thought. Now, and there are a lot of other people who aren't, let's say, true believers of it. They'll treat me as a heretic because they're worried that by me arguing about it, by me making the arguments that I do, that I'm actually mucking up the picture for them. In other words, they want to do their best that they can do in engaging progressives and building alliances with progressives. And if I come out there and start convincing people that wokeism is a real problem and that they should review their partnerships carefully, then I'm making trouble for them. And so I'm a heretic in that sense as well. Okay,
I just want to hold up the book again. I thought the subtitle of this might well have been Woke Anti-Semitism is Bad for the Jews. And I noticed in one of your interviews, you actually said, as we say, bad for the Jews, because this is and I'm Jewish myself, a Jewish tradition. Is this
good for the Jews or bad
thing good for the Jews or bad for the Jews? And then you argue. Strangely enough, it seems to me, in your account, and you've been in many Jewish organizations for many years, I was struck by one, there was never that discussion before endorsing it. And two, when it was demonstrated that it was bad for the Jews, they went full speed ahead anyway. And three, in most of your chapters, I saw very little discussion of issues that would benefit Jews per se. It seemed to be obsessed with the African-American community, which struck me as odd, honestly. I had no idea there was such an obsession. Now, some of it may be because we were slaves in Egypt and African Americans were slaves here. But, you know, perhaps you can explain how much
Right.
time in Jewish organizations is spent dealing with African American issues.
Well, it's not just necessarily African American issues, it's like the broader range of social justice issues, immigrant rights, and criminal justice reform and the like. But I think, in fairness, I'm not that I agree necessarily with the logic and the way that it's being deployed now, but in fairness, it's not just because we were slaves in the land of Egypt, although it is that too among some of these folks. It's that they believe that there's a process of reciprocity with other communities. So if we support them in their issues, they'll support us in our issues. The old phrase, in order to have a friend, you have to be a friend. That's the underlying logic of it. So if you want African Americans to care about us as Jews at all, if you want them to care about anti-Semitism, if you want them to care about Israel, then you're going to have to care about issues that are on higher in their list as well. That's the logic. Okay, it's that the average community relations professional or lay leader would talk of. And what was the little discussion about these issues that, look, wokeism, unlike any quote unquote policy issue that we've ever dealt with, is very hard to talk about because people insist that it's true. So the very process of debating wokeism in a way is heretical in and of itself. You're supposed to believe it, not question it. And so a Jewish organization that has a culture of debate, that debates every issue, dots every I, crosses every T, make sure that we've create consensus on what you might consider minute policy details, skips over all of that when it comes to this anti-racism debate. They don't even talk about what equity means, whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. It's not debated, it's accepted. Now, what they might do is they might accept the most charitable interpretation of these concepts so as not to imply that they are radical. So, for example, when defund the police came out of Black Lives Matter, they say, well, what they really mean is that we should turn over some of the services done by police and allow social workers and others to do those services. They don't really mean defunding the police. Well, of course, we saw several police departments get their budgets slashed in places like Minneapolis precisely because the activists really meant defund the police or abolish the police. So I think that's how this plays out.
Okay, let me ask a little bit more about the reaction, because I was saying you had interviews on TV in the UK on GBN with Andrew Doyle, JTV with someone named Ollie, also in Great Britain, the Australian Jewish Association, your own podcast from the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, a very interesting, it looked like African-American broadcast called Cut the Bull, the Begin Center in Israel, something called Med for Israel, and the Combat Anti-Semitism Movement. I don't see any progressive or liberal, aside from the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, or democratic, or I don't even see live streams from synagogues or Jewish community centers or the 92nd Street Y, or any of the places you would think would be interested when you had a leader of a major Jewish organization who worked for 13 years at the American Jewish Committee, which in my understanding is perhaps the most prominent Jewish organization in the United States. I mean, it publishes commentary, for goodness sake.
It used to publish commentary.
It no longer does?
No, it doesn't.
I'm out of date. All right, but they're very prominent.
Okay.
Jewish organization. I was just at a event in San Francisco paying tribute to the Portuguese diplomat who saved my mother's family, and they had a rabbi there from the American Jewish Committee at the Jewish Community Center. So they certainly have access to venues, and they certainly can have public debates and discussions if they want. Likewise, You've been reviewed by the Allgemeiner, which is a Jewish publication, the Religion News Service, which isn't particularly, Fathom, which I guess I don't really know what that one is. What's that one?
It's a new publication that publishes around Israel and these types of ideological issues.
I mean, does it have a political orientation?
And it's probably center right.
Okay. Then we have the White Rose magazine, which I did some things with Charles Jacobs.
Well, he's not behind that. Charles, it's
no, but they published something about him. So I would imagine it's not totally establishment. The Mosaic, Law and Liberty, Spiked, which is very anti-establishment, the Times of Israel, which again is Israel, the Jewish News Service, which is very conservative, the Tribune Juive, which I don't know. Where is that?
It's a French publication.
In France?
I don't know. Yes.
Amazing. This is the thing.
France is very French are very anti-woke. Very
That's
an
important point to make to our American Jewish listeners. The French are very anti-woke, including the French intellectuals who used to have a lot of influence in the United States, going back to Voltaire. But today, we rarely see them quoted. I mean, then you have Le Monde, which did a review. And then you have Zeman, which is Israeli, I guess. And then the Jewish Journal, which I think is Los Angeles. Is that right?
It is.
Yeah. And Auditor Online, I don't know, but it seems to be in German. Is that from Germany?
That's a German publication, yes.
So in other words, you're getting established mainstream coverage in Germany and in Israel and in France and in Britain. Yet somehow people in America are not fully exposed to what you have to say. And can you tell me a little bit? You said to me in the prep that in fact, behind the scenes, people are reading your book, they're debating it, they're discussing it in the leadership of the American Jewish community. But somehow we're not seeing that on the outside. What's that about?
What is that about? So I think a lot of American Jewish leaders are thought, by and large, not everyone equally, but by and large are thoughtful people who pay a lot of attention to the threats that Jews face. And if they've been paying attention, they probably know that woke ideology is an accelerator of anti-Semitism on the left. And I talked to some of them who will say as much behind closed doors, but they're worried. Why are they worried? Well, they're worried because they might have young staff people who are themselves woke and they don't want to have problems on their hand in their own staff meetings and the like. They're worried because they may have donors or board members who are woke and they don't want to alienate those people. They're worried because they have a lot of sunk costs. They've been building relationships with the progressive left for years in order to try to stem the tide of anti-Israelism. And so they're in relationship with all kinds of groups. And as soon as they catch a whiff of wokeness or any critique of this ideology, some of those groups will abandon the Jewish community or abandon those organizations. So they have reason to be scared or reluctant. It's just that what they're doing is not naming a major cause of anti-Semitism, and that's very problematic. And I think as a result, it distorts how we fight anti-Semitism and how we think about anti-Semitism, how we fight anti-Semitism, and the kind of alliances that we build to try to counter this form of anti-Semitism.
All right. Now, your book goes into great detail where you describe meetings, you describe initiatives, you describe all sorts of things that happen in these various Jewish organizations that I assumed you were a part of at the time. Did you quit in a big conflict over wokeism? I mean, why are you no longer in American Jewish leadership circles?
Look, I don't really want to get into the details of why I left. Clearly, though, there was a backdrop. Let me put it this way. There was a backdrop of ideological disagreement. And my concern was, and I expressed this to my leadership, that we had entered a very fraught political environment and we weren't adequately debating these concepts. and that we were sort of doing this without the forethought, without the strategic planning that would normally be required to make such huge ideological leaps. I'm sure that there were people who thought I was totally wrong, and in being wrong, that I was going to create a big disconnect between my organization or other Jewish organizations in the center-left progressive space, that I was going to create a big disconnect between them and our traditional allies.
Well, you're talking a lot in this word of allies and progressive center left. And I have to say, I was a little surprised by this because I always thought that groups like the American Jewish Committee or the Jewish Council for Public Affairs or the Jewish, whatever, public relations or whatever, there are a million of these groups. I always thought they were nonpartisan, non-political, and just sort of, and the most shocking thing you have in your book is the National Council of Christians and Jews changed its name to the National Council of Community and Justice, which is like, how did that happen? I mean, can you talk a little bit of that?
I mean, I think
how political are these mainstream, what are seen as non-political organizations?
well, I'm not sure why these are not all these words that you use do not all mean the same thing. So partisan is one thing and political is something else, right? Partisan is, are you a Democrat or Republican? I think most Jewish organizations try to, except for some on the far right or far left, are very clearly nonpartisan. They work very hard not to do anything that can be construed as partisanship. But that doesn't mean that they don't have stances on policies. And those policies that they might have stances might be associated with one ideological camp or the other. So I think that's really the issue here. And you know, many mainstream Jewish organizations have taken stances, because that's what the majority of Jews think, that might be considered more associated with the Democratic Party.
Here's another question. You say that. I live in Florida. 40% of the Jews in Florida voted for Donald Trump. 30% of the Jews nationally voted for Donald Trump. In any sort of universe, that's a substantial minority, even though it's not a majority. Why do I get the sense that there's zero representation at the table of these mainstream organizations of, for example, Trump voters?
I don't think that there's zero, but it's small. You know, partly because they're actively repelling people with those points of view, and because people with those points of view are actively repelled, right? It's if you're a Trump voter and people are talking about how we should be welcoming to immigrants, and you don't agree with that policy, then you're probably going to stay away from the organization. That said, in every one of these organizations, there are Republicans, every one of them that I've seen.
Well, let's talk about Trump voters specifically, because there's not the same thing. Okay. The fact of the matter is Donald Trump had a Middle East policy. Donald Trump has a record in Jewish affairs. Donald Trump's daughter is a Jewish convert, and not only that, Orthodox with Lookstein in New York. He's intimately involved with Jewish issues. Stephen Miller, one of his top aides, was Jewish, and so forth. He's from New York City. His tenants were Jewish in his houses. He knows the Jewish community, and the Jewish community knows him. And the fact of the matter is that after reading your book, I would say that there probably isn't a single Trump voter on the staff of a major Jewish organization, even though in New York City,
it's not true,
even though in
Larry.
New York City, there are Jews who voted for Trump.
That's not true, Larry. I mean, I can tell you for a fact there are Trump voters. Probably in every one of these organizations, there are one or two Trump voters, either on the staff or
okay. Well, you're reassuring me.
No,
Okay.
it's not a lot. It's
how come they don't seem to be represented at the table? I mean, if anyone's marginalized, it would seem to me to be the Trump supporters in Jewish organizations.
Maybe. Look, I'm not writing about Trump here. I'm writing about wokeism. I mean, that's all true.
It's the same, isn't it?
No, it's not.
Anyone who's anti-woke is seen as pro-Trump. Trump was the anti-woke candidate.
Yeah, but look, there's a lot of anti-woke people like me who are not Trump voters. I mean, you know, there are liberal humanists out there who are anti-woke, and they're not supportive of the right either. There's more than two camps out there, right?
But
There
why?
are,
Let me ask you why. Why these same Jewish organizations want to build alliances with the left, the progressive left, the center left, the whatever left. They don't say we also want to build equally alliances with the right.
well, I'm not defending them. I'm just giving you a sense of what the context is for all
Now
this.
I'm asking you to
Um,
explain the mentality to me. If you're
right,
trying to build an effective coalition, right, to
right.
pursue
Some of them
defense of
do,
the
like,
Jew.
right. Some of them do. There's been an evangelical Jewish dialogue taking place every year for, I don't know, at least a dozen years that I participated in with very high level officials from the Jewish community in it. I'm not saying that they devote the same level of energy to that than they do the dialogue or the disc with Latinos or Black American organizations, but it's been going on for years. So it's not that,
Okay.
it's just that they don't prioritize it in the same way.
But why not? I'm asking you if you were actually trying to do a level playing field thing to build the
They're
broadest
not trying to
coalition of
level, they're
support.
not trying to do a level playing field. They're not trying to do a level playing field. They're trying to they're trying to win on a specific set of issues. See, they believe that in America that's anti-immigrant, that's xenophobic in the way that they understand xenophobia, is going to be bad for the Jews. They believe that that an America that is incarcerating many Black people is not going to be an America that's particularly good for the Jews. And they believe that, so they agree with the policy agenda more or less, and they want to work with people to enact that policy agenda. And they also believe that in doing so, that they'll also influence their thinking about Jews in Israel in the process. So their priority is not to win over evangelicals. They may even fear, because they believe that the evangelicals have a different political orientation, ideological orientation, really want to convert us in the end. And so that's just not the priority. That's not where their political or ideological sympathies lie.
I appreciate your explanation. Have you read a new book by Walter Russell Mead called The Ark of the Covenant, which is a history of American relations, with Jews and with Israel?
It's in the other room of my house, and I haven't opened it yet, but I
Okay, well,
got
it's
it about a week and a
absolutely
half ago.
fascinating. And
He's
this
great.
goes back to day one and Chaim Solomon and all the rest. The point I'm trying to make here is, it seems to me what you're saying are sort of loaded questions or loaded issues. For example, you say anti-immigrant. Well, Donald Trump is married to an immigrant. First of all, his children speak Czech. They went every summer to the Czech Republic to vacation. The fact of the matter is, many immigrants work construction.
I'm not opposing
No,
Donald
no,
Trump
let me,
here.
no, but
I know, but
I'm
Larry,
saying Trump
I
is a
don't care. That's
symbol.
fine. That's fine.
Trump is a
We
symbol
could
of
have
things.
that, but it's not right.
Okay, well, let me tell you a story. I used to belong to a synagogue in Washington, D.C., which was called Temple Sinai.
I know it well.
And among one of the members is Merrick Garland, who's currently the Attorney General. I never met him, but the year I quit, they had a Purim festival. Purim's coming up. They had a Purim spiel, and Haman was Donald Trump. It was the most I didn't go, but it was
That's
literally
really,
the most
yeah.
unfair, dishonest thing you could do. And that had been fairly reasonable prior, but it became more and more extreme. And I noticed you said that Rabbi Waltby from Sinai Temple, which is conservative in Los Angeles, is on your board and helps you with your work. And he had said he didn't want any politics from the pulpit. And my mother was a member of that temple and synagogue, actually, and conservative. And I went there after she died, and I heard the sermons. And I went up. There was a lady rabbi and her husband who were doing it at that point. And I said, I really appreciate that there were no politics in your sermon here. It was so refreshing. And now I see from your book, it was the policy of the synagogue, because the idea is people are going to disagree about politics. Why assume they agree, and why drive away and make a hostile environment for those who have other views? So I'm saying, one group of people are the 30% of Jews in America who voted for President Trump. That's a constituency in the Jewish community. And that's a constituency, those are allies who are not being reached out to by the mainstream Jewish organizations.
Well, yeah, and I do write about that I think that woke ideology creates even a greater sort of ideological partisan feel in Jewish life that repels Jewish conservatives. And that's in one of the chapters of my book on the assault on Jewish pride. So I agree with that it does create a hostile environment for people who don't vote Democratic.
So in other words, what you're actually saying in your book, and I think that's the reason people don't want to discuss it, these Jewish organizations are de facto pro-democratic, even if not officially. Because, for instance, President Trump says, don't let in Islamic terrorists to blow up Jews. And that may not be bad for the Jews.
Yeah, look, there are different views on whether that's a problem and what the problem is and so forth. I think that it is true that some of the organizations we're talking about really do have very definitive partisan loyalties. And some of them, it's a little less clear. There are a lot more conservatives on the board. So I don't think you can paint them all with the same broad brush. But there's certainly an ideological flavor of these organizations that tends to be more center left and center right.
Okay, I appreciate that. Let me go on and ask you another question. You talk a lot about this woke ideology like it's something new. And I think you're younger than me. I graduated from college in 1977. But when I was in college, there were left-wingers, and they were anti-Israel. And I also went to UCLA as a graduate student a little later in the 90s. And there was a African-American newspaper called NOMO, which was the official Black Student Alliance or whatever publication. And it was just filled with anti-Semitic and anti-Israel stuff all the time. And so that venom was being pumped out, and no one ever said or did anything about it back then. I don't know how new this is. I think what you actually have is a policy of no enemies to the left. And so the ADL will criticize Nazis without ever saying how many of them there are, but will not publicly criticize leftist anti-Semites and anti-Israel.
Look, I'm not necessarily sympathetic with the ADL's approach on some of these, and I was explicitly critical of the ADL's on that, but I don't think that's true. ADL, and you can certainly more recently, I think that criticism might have held more even a few months ago, but I think that they've been much more explicit in condemning left-wing anti-Semitism in recent months. Yeah, look, your point, though, your larger point about that this is not new, it's an interesting one, because there's been strands of this ideology that have been around for a long time. Post-colonialism, for example, this idea that successful countries that were former colonizers are the reason why the colonized countries are languishing. That's been around for a long time, and that's animated the sort of the global left for many decades. And that certainly was a major factor in why Israel was portrayed as the oppressor even 40 years ago, right? So that's been around a long time. You also have sort of the Black Power movement, which emerged in the late 1960s, and that had an effect. And so it's not that this is brand new, but what you're seeing now is sort of the popularization of this ideology in a very specific form that is now making its way through institutions that it didn't have any influence on previously. That's the difference. So, for example, Goldman Sachs might have a diversity, equity, and inclusion program that talks about who the oppressed and oppressors are. I don't know exactly what their program looks like, but I assume they have some kind of DEI program there. That wasn't the case when you were in college. So so you didn't have all these K through 12 curricula that are making their way through public schools and private schools in the same way. It's been around in the university setting for a long time, but not everywhere in the university setting. Now it's now even biology departments require professors who want tenure to sign statements or explain what their personal policies are around diversity, equity, inclusion. So what you're seeing is an ideology that's been around, this oppress ideology, that also mirrors certain Marxist themes as well, and that has been around a long time, taking a new form and spreading throughout American institutional life.
Okay, that's very interesting. And you do have some really shocking cases of it in your book. I think did you go to see Stokely Carmichael when you were in college?
I did.
Yeah, and that's
Yes.
in the book too. And he's just
Right.
full of anti-Semitism. And he was paid by the university to
Yes, he
spew
was.
hatred of Jews. Now he would probably have his own TV show on MSNBC. But the fact of the matter is that you're making a good point, and that's the one flaw I found in your book. I don't know, you said you were from a progressive background. I don't know exactly what that means, but
Or do I?
I used to work for David Horowitz, who used to be a member of the Communist Party and who helped found the Black Panthers. And isn't it true that what we call woke ideology, or formerly politically correctness, or formerly the party line, is in fact just the latest iteration of the communist, communist manifesto, you might even say, that in fact, these are basically at root communist ideology wearing different types of sheep's clothing. You have an introduction by Nathan Sharansky. I thought it was very fascinating. Of course, he was the great hero with getting Jewish dissidents out, refuseniks, to Israel, and he was imprisoned himself. And he says, it reminds me of things I saw in the former Soviet Union. But he never even says, this looks like a communist conspiracy. How do you respond to that analysis?
Yeah, I don't think look, it clearly grows out of the Marxist tradition. That is a fact. That is absolutely the case. I don't think it's the same thing. It's different in certain ways. And by the way, there are a number of sort of American socialists that detest wokeism. I mean, wokeism, if you talk to like a socialist activist, there might be some of them that are woke, but many of them believe that wokeism has actually replaced the proper focus on class, which they believe is the fundamental unit of concern, not race, not culture. So what this did, what wokeism did, is substitute culture for economic class, and use some of the same language, some of the same concepts, but change the fundamental unit of analysis. So I don't think it's the same thing, and that's why there's so many socialists who oppose wokeism.
Well, there were socialists who opposed communism in the Cold War. We promoted anti-communist socialists in Europe, in rebuilding Europe, and in America as well. That was acceptable. However, let's go into this a little further because it interests me, because I don't know if it's that you actually have a different view or you just don't want to say. But Antonio Gramsci was the head of the Communist Party of Italy. And his papers are now at Notre Dame, where Professor Buttigieg, the father of our current Secretary of Transportation, was the leading expert and keeper of the flame. The Gramscian approach, which was a communist approach because of the failure of the working class to rise up in the West, specifically in the United States, where they were anti-communist. Famously, in 1968, they beat the hippies or whatever, and Nixon cheered them. The construction workers, some of whom probably worked for Trump Construction. The decision was made to organize through the institutions, and the way to do that would be specifically to use these cultural issues, including feminism and race and sexuality in general. And some of this is older. There was the Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Hippolytus. I don't know how much old communist history you want to go into here, but how can you discuss this without talking about communism as an issue? Seriously, as the root cause of this, and it's not that complicated. Anything that's done to bring down the capitalist system is justified.
Yeah, it's just that I don't think it fully encapsulates the entirety of the debate. Look, there are plenty of hardened capitalists that are buying into woke ideology. And they're doing it as a way to sort of deflect the sort of economic concerns. They're doing it to show their progressive bona fides without actually doing anything differently economically. So, it's not, so I just think it's more complicated than that. I don't think it gives you an accurate picture of what's happening. I mean, Goldman Sachs is not undertaking its DEI program in order to overturn capitalism. It's just not. Now, it doesn't mean that there aren't Marxist roots. As I said before, there are absolutely Marxist roots to woke ideology. And there are people that are promoting woke ideology in today, especially in the K through 12 curriculum. And I could give you they're just hardened Marxists, absolutely the case. But I think it's a bigger phenomenon than that. Those people are sort of the core ideologues behind some of what's spread in the long march through institutions, as it's called. But they're not the entire enterprise. There are a bunch of people who are capitalists who are very much behind wokeism and believe that wokeism is part of sort of the next stage of our sort of market economy. I mean, so and so I just think it simplifies too much. That's all.
Okay, well, let's talk about this because this is interesting. Because one of the things that comes across in your book, and you even mentioned it here, are the rich donors to these Jewish organizations, some of whom are woke, I assume some of whom are capitalists. Although Lenin had some rich supporters too. They used to be called, well, at a certain point, Neiman Marxists. But in any case, that was later.
Right.
The issue is, how do you reach those people who are so rich, who are so powerful, and they have these ideas that they've gotten probably from going to Ivy League schools? How do you persuade them that woke ideology is bad for the Jews?
Yeah. See, they're not even my first target audience, to be honest with you. Like, they're downstream as far as I'm concerned. The first target audience is, there's a lot of people who already agree with me on this. They're just scared to create a problem for themselves. They're scared of being canceled. They're scared of being called a racist. They're scared of being called privileged. They're scared that their social or their professional lives will be affected by speaking out. So what the first order of business for me is to get those people to speak up and say, we have a problem here and I'm not willing to sit on the sidelines. That's the first order of business. And then there are people, there's another target audience, maybe one step further back from them downstream, who don't like what they're hearing, but they haven't quite formulated their thoughts about it. They may be people with sort of liberal inclinations, but they're people who don't like to be told what to think, or they don't believe that America is an oppressive country, and so they're sort of confused by the whole thing. I think those people also can be moved, but I think our first order of business is to get the people who already agree with us to start to speak out and to find the courage of their convictions. And it's only way, way downstream, if we're successful with those other two audiences, that I would try to see if we can move people who have already sort of bought into the ideology.
I see. So you have your own step-by-step approach. Let me ask you a little bit about what you're doing, because you mentioned it in your book. Hold up the cover again. You have the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. I'm assuming it's in this book. You're the head of it. You founded it. What do you see yourself doing in terms of operations to make this a reality? And let me ask you another thing. Do you have a magazine or newsletter of your own that people can subscribe to?
So we definitely have our website, and you can subscribe to our website. We send out newsletters. We don't have some kind of academic journal. We publish I think we have published several background papers that I think could be of interest, like critical race theory in the Jews. We've done one on on whether or not diversity, equity, inclusion programs violate civil rights laws, and so forth. So what are we trying to do? We're trying to do two things. We're trying to get the mainstream Jewish community to understand the problem of woke anti-Semitism. I call it the front door strategy. To come in the front door and get them to talk to us and understand over time that there's a problem with this ideology that sort of emerged in full force after the death of George Floyd, and we have to contend with its ramifications now. The second thing we're trying to do is build a new coalition of multi-ethnic coalition with Chinese and Indian and Black Americans and others who agree with us that this is a big problem. And there are many that agree with us that this is a big problem. Let's start working together and come and have a united front as much as possible opposing this ideology and standing up for what you might call classical liberal values that have been the traditional glue of American society.
Okay, well, that's interesting because you mentioned United Front, because when I was very young, I was a Trotskyist or Trotskyite, depending on whether you're a Stalinist or not. And the United Front was their strategy, and the Popular Front was the Stalinist strategy. And of course, you talk a great deal about intersectionality. I don't know how familiar you are with all of this, but many of our viewers might be, the few that we have. And it seems to me intersectionality is just the Popular Front all over again. And Black Lives Matter is the Black Panthers, and it is SDS. And we've seen this movie before. We never saw it officially endorsed by the government and the Department of Justice and the FBI like we did now, but it's certainly been there. They did it once before. Now they did it more successfully on a bigger scale. The United Front approach can be very successful. Would you accept in your United Front people like David Horowitz or Pamela Geller or people on the right who or white working class people who just have had it and want to go back to an America where people are judged on the content of their character rather than the color of their skin?
Well, I mean, I think that latter group especially makes a lot of sense, right? There are plenty of white working class people who believe in those values, and I think that's perfectly fine. Question is, can you work? It's not whether there are certain people I won't work with, will work with. I'm not much for litmus tests in general, but if we have to be able to come up with a common agenda. And so I'm more interested in finding the people that are going to help do this work. I mean, I'm not in getting, I work like in a thought experiment about whether Pamela Geller would be part of the coalition. I don't know. That's not what I'm after. I'm after finding, Chinese Americans who are worried about their kids' schooling. That's what I want to do. Or Black Americans who don't want their kids to be taught that the system is rigged against them. Or white Americans who feel that they want to go back to some notion of the American dream. So I'm not, that's where I'm at. I don't want to necessarily litigate every ideological litmus test that the Jewish community has debated in the past. It's just not it's not worth it. I'm trying to build actual coalitions of people to do something positive and to fight back against this ideology.
Okay, I think that's a worthy goal. Just trying to get into how you were going to do it in terms of nuts and bolts.
Sure.
Let me just ask you, what do you have coming up? Somebody watching this, to wrap this up, I'll put a link into the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values website at the bottom. What events or issues or next steps do you have that viewers of this might be able to participate in?
Yeah, so we're constantly having live stream events. There are several that are being planned. I know we're planning one with the Indian community and Indian groups that agree with us that wokeism is a problem, and we're going to do one there. It's still being in formation, but it'll be out soon. Some of the things we have planned are a little harder to access for the average person too. Like, we're going to take a group of ethnic leaders who are part of this new coalition to Israel, and probably in May. We're nailing down the dates now. We're forming this new coalition that is going to pose radical ethnic studies in schools. So that's in formation now. And the thing that I think that your viewers can help the most with is that we want to be able to talk to synagogues, to Jewish federations, to Jewish organizations. And if they're part of those institutions, maybe they can pick up the phone or get on their computer and email the rabbi or the head of the federation and say, why don't you give them a listen? Why don't you hear them out? I know maybe not your starting point, but if you believe in viewpoint diversity, if you believe that there needs to be a multiplicity of viewpoints in the room, then why don't you live up to that value and bring in the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values for a talk? I'll do a Zoom talk, as you know, to any Jewish group that's interested. So let's get through the door and let's start to change the culture of the Jewish community that way. And so your viewers can help with that. They can help us get through the door. They can be our sponsors in that way to get around the gatekeepers in the Jewish community that are trying to keep us out of the room.
Okay, that sounds very worthwhile. What about Rabbi Wolpe, who's a big name in Jewish circles? He's written many books. My mother read them. I read some of them. I disagree with him about whether the Exodus actually happened. I believe it did. But is there any thought of sending him on a speaking tour? It would be a lot harder to keep him out of a synagogue.
Well, he does go on speaking tours. He does do speaking. He's also working with a foundation called the Maimonides Fund, and they've been doing work on viewpoint diversity. And so he's a voice that's out there. He'll pick his spots. And maybe there's more that we could do with Rabbi Wolpe. So we'll have to think about that and talk about that.
Do you have a speakers bureau with rabbis on it?
Not at the moment, but it's something that we've seriously contemplated. You know, we're a small team of 3 people right now. I think we're on the verge of becoming a bigger team in the days ahead. But we are a small team and have limited bandwidth. So there's certain things that we'd love to do that we just haven't been able to do yet because we don't have enough people to do everything that we'd like to do.
The one other thing I would like to see, if you had a newsletter or magazine physical, you could mail it to all the libraries. Also, they're eliminating a lot of them at the various synagogues and Jewish community centers.
Right.
So
well, there's a great
journal.
There's a great journal called Sapir. It's about a year and a half old. It is edited by Brett Stevens of the New York Times, and it publishes a lot of articles that are consistent with our approach. And I would urge you all to take a look at it. You can find it online, but you can also get the physical copy of Sapir. I think Sapir would be a great publication for that purpose.
Oh, okay. I looked at it online, but it was expensive. You had to subscribe. I was thinking of something they would get free, you know, so that you'd have a sponsor to subsidize. But I'll take a look at Sapir because I looked at it, but then they wanted to charge for a subscription.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
I mean, it's probably worth it. They're professionals, but
they're good at what they do. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah. So basically, you're 3 people on your own to try and counter wokeism. Do you have any supporters with deep pockets? Do you have a Goldman Sachs behind you? Do you have anybody who will, match them dollar for dollar?
Well,
is there a George Soros in your organization?
Maybe not George Soros yet, or the degree that we have a George Soros, they're not giving us funding at that level, but we have great supporters. And in 1 year, we were able to build up a robust organization that's doing all kinds of good things. And hopefully we'll find more of deep pocket supporters in the months ahead. I think there's some really good things on the horizon. And so the next time you interview me, I'll be able to tell you more about that. But
oh, great.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good one. And if anybody watching this wants to chip in, I'll put it to the organization and they can write you a check or send
that would
you
be great.
PayPal
you
or
could,
whatever it is.
Look at jilv.org/donate, I believe. And if you hit that click, you can donate, and that would be wonderful. And you can buy my book. That would be wonderful as well.
I will definitely hold up the book one more time. It's Woke Anti-Semitism, How a Progressive Ideology Harms Jews by David L. Bernstein with a foreword by Natan Sharansky.